Good afternoon. Welcome to Cornell University ILR School's webcast in recognition of the 5th anniversary of the Lilly Ledbetter Fair Pay Act. My name is Linda Barrington. I'm the Executive Director of the Institute for Compensation Studies here at the ILR School. 5 years ago today, on January 29th, the Lilly Ledbetter Act was signed into law. This law was a targeted response at the Supreme Court ruling that was against Lilly in the Ledbetter v. Goodyear case. In that case, the court ruled that if one wanted to sue for pay discrimination, the statute of limitations clock starts ticking when the employer makes the first discriminatory pay decision, not when the most recent unfair pay check is received. In other words, the Supreme Court ruled that under the Civil Rights Act of 1964, Lilly Ledbetter should have filed her lawsuit before she knew she was being discriminated against. The Lilly Ledbetter Act amended the Civil Rights Act of 1964 to specify that the 180-day statute of limitations for filing a discriminatory suit resets after each discriminatory paycheck. Advocates of the law said this is what the initial law intended. Opponents warned that there would be a flood of pay discrimination lawsuits following the decision. In today's webcast, we're going to tap ILR's expertise to talk about the Lilly Ledbetter Act, but also about the challenge of pay equity in general. ILR is unique in its breadth and depth of expertise on what employers and workers need to know about pay equity, but also about the challenge and opportunity for where we can go in the future. ILR School's mission is to advance the world of work, and pay equity is part and parcel of this. So before we get started, I have two quick instructions. First, if you could close all the browsers on your computer except for the one you're watching this webcast from, that will do two things. It will limit your temptation to multitask, but it'll also make sure that we don't get an echo in the sound stream from the webcast. And second, if you have questions, we'd love for you to send them during the webcast. There's a speech bubble icon at the bottom right-hand corner of your screen. Some of you did send questions while you registered, and we're going to incorporate as much of those as we can. So moderating today's webcast from Ives Hall is Beth Livingston, Assistant Professor of HR Studies here at Cornell, and Stephanie Thomas, who's our Research Associate at the Institute for Compensation Studies. Beth's research is on gender and work-family balance, and she has additional interests in discrimination, diversity, and stereotyping. Stephanie's research is on compensation with a focus on selection decisions in the workplace and with an emphasis on discrimination. Beth and Stephanie, thank you for hosting us today.
Good afternoon, and thanks for joining us this afternoon. During the webcast, you'll be hearing from several ILR faculty members about various aspects of equal pay. In the interest of having as much discussion time as possible, we're going to keep our introduction of these experts to a minimum. You can read their full biographies by using the hyperlinks embedded in the presentation. So let's get right to it and start by listening to Lilly Ledbetter talk about the anonymous note that she found in her work locker that listed her salary along with her 3 male counterparts, and how her experiences ultimately led to the enactment of the Lilly Ledbetter Fair Pay Act.
I went into work. Always did, an hour to an hour and a half early, and to get my mail, to check my email. I looked at the mail and immediately fell out a rough torn piece of paper, about a quarter of a sheet of 8.5 by 11 paper, 4 first names, Lilly, and 3 men. And when I looked and saw how much those men were making, base pay only, just base pay, I just felt so degraded. I don't think I've ever had a lower point. Immediately, my mind started calculating overtime, because overtime was a big, it was a big motivator. I had children in college. We had a mortgage to pay. We had car payments. We had the usual expense that families have, and it was so hard to make ends meet. But then to stand there and look at those numbers and just think back how hard it'd been on my family when it was totally unnecessary. And I did not see how I could muster up enough of dignity to get through a 12-hour shift. I finally walked around a while and went into the ladies' lounge and tried to talk to myself and get my courage up, knowing I had to get through the shift. I really wanted to take my bag and go home. I really just wanted to run away and hide. But I couldn't do that. I couldn't. And I had to stay and face it. I got home the next morning. I explained to my husband what I had learned. And I said, unless you object, I want to file a charge with the Equal Employment Commission in Birmingham, Alabama. If I started it, I would be in it for the long haul. I wouldn't be a quitter. And he said, what time do you want to leave?
It's a very powerful clip, and I want to just briefly, before we get going, because we have had some questions, just make sure if you want to ask us questions during the webcast, we very much encourage it, and we're going to have some time at the end to address those. Use the speech bubble on the bottom corner of the screen, and feel free to ask whatever you want. And you can also click on the top of the screen for captioning if you would like to use that as well. It's a very powerful clip that we just watched, and every time I watch it, I continue to be affected by it, because there's palpable emotion that you see when you're hearing this from Lilly Ledbetter's own mouth about how she felt when she found out she was being discriminated against, and the way in which this affected her feelings of self-worth as well as her dignity. But there was also an important point that she made about the practical nature of this discrimination and how this could have taken food out of the mouth of her children. It affected sending your kids to college, etc. And I think it's a really important thing to consider, the fact that you have both this emotional, symbolic nature of pay, but also this very practical nature of it as well. Interestingly, Stephanie, you actually got a chance to speak with Lilly Ledbetter a couple years ago after the publication of her book. Would you like to tell us a little bit about your experience with that to lay a groundwork for today's presentation?
Absolutely. I did have the honor and opportunity to speak to Lilly, and the thing that really struck me about our conversation is her strong commitment to pay equity. And she initially filed her charge of discrimination in 1998. And even after all of these years, it's still a very personal issue for her. She did lose in court. She never received any kind of financial remuneration from this. And as Beth mentioned, it's really about more than just pay. It's about the impact on families, and that's one of the things that Lilly really stressed to me. Pay equity is not just a women's issue. It's really a household issue. And one report from the AFL-CIO and the Institute for Women's Policy Research looked at the income levels of single mothers, married women, and single women, and they found if men and women earned exactly the same amount, women's income would increase anywhere from 6 to about 17%. And this increase in income really translates into a reduction in poverty somewhere on the order of 50% to 84%. And that's a really big gap. You know, lower earnings naturally make it harder for people to provide care for their children, to put food on the table, to make ends meet. And the other thing that Lilly really stressed to me was it's not just about base pay. It's about overtime, it's about bonus, and about her retirement income. And a study by the American Association of Retired Persons found that there's a gap of about $8,000 between unmarried women's retirement benefits and their male counterparts. And this study attributes about 2/3 of that $8,000 differential to the pay gap itself, the gap in earnings, and occupational segregation. And, you know, just to reiterate, it's about overtime, it's about your base pay, it's about all of these different forms of compensation. And the way Lilly expressed it to me was she said, suddenly it hit me that it's not only my overtime and base pay now, it's my retirement. My contributory retirement was based on it. And she received a matching contribution from her employer. Her Social Security retirement benefits are now lower as a result of her lower pay. So it really translates into not just a women's issue, but a family issue, an economic issue, and a societal issue.
Absolutely. Those are very interesting points, because when we are talking about pay equity, we talk a lot about fairness, right? That this is just a naturally fair thing to do, but sometimes we forget the practical nature behind this and how this can actually hurt women and their families when we're talking about pay equity. This situation that Lilly Ledbetter went through, it was a pretty straightforward issue in terms of gender discrimination. You had a woman doing the exact same job in the exact same company as 3 men and was paid less for doing that job. That's a pretty straightforward instance of pay discrimination. The issue of pay equity, however, can be a lot more complex than that. There are a lot of issues that can go into whether men and women are being paid equally for equal work. One of the issues we want to talk a little bit about today is occupational segregation, and Stephanie mentioned that a moment ago when she talked about the study from the AARP. But I do think it's important that we talk a little bit about the way in which the pay gap and pay inequity in general can be exacerbated by the types of jobs that men and women are sorted or sort themselves into based on societal expectations and norms. Luckily at ILR we have Professor Eileen DeVault here who can talk a little bit about the historical background of this occupational segregation.
The gender gap in wages has always existed, and in large part that's because there's always been occupational segregation by sex. And we see that dating, back to when women first started taking jobs outside of their homes. And if you look in the 19th century, as the agrarian economy transformed into an industrial manufacturing economy, women were some of the first people to take jobs in the new factories. But they did that by following tasks they had previously done in their individual homes. Because women followed those kinds of jobs out of their homes into the waged labor force, they ended up in low-paying, what we now think of as pink-collar kinds of jobs. So there has always been, although it's changed somewhat, there has always been sex segregation in the labor force. And that's a lot of why women are paid less than men are. If men are in higher paying jobs, then women are going to have lower wages overall. Societal change has made a difference, and it's particularly made a difference in that women are less likely now to work just for a couple years and then get married and stop work completely, so that married women are much more likely to be participating in the paid labor force. And even women with small children are more likely to be working, so that women have a more continuous career in the labor force now. And that was one of the things, too, that used to harm their wage earning possibilities. It's always important to remember that all of the assumptions that we hold about who holds different jobs or how much they should be paid or what their role is supposed to be in their family, all of those things are not natural, biological factors. They're things that are really socially constructed. In other words, the society that we live in has these assumptions about what women do, what men do, and what we all do best. And we grow up with those assumptions. And so it means that, for example, it's not that women look around and say, oh, I really want a low-paying job. They say, oh, I love children because I'm a young girl and I babysat all of my childhood where the boy was delivering newspapers or something. So I think I want to be an elementary school teacher rather than a finance person on Wall Street. All of these things are very much rooted in very complex and deep assumptions about what we should all do with our lives and how gender operates in those.
And while there's less occupational segregation today than there was 5 or 10 years ago, we still have cases of occupational segregation in the United States. The interesting thing about Lilly's case, just to reiterate, is that occupational segregation really wasn't an issue for her. It was a question of 3 other men who were working in the same job that she was, so it wasn't an occupational segregation issue. We received a question about whether or not the pay gap has improved over time. And just to sort of follow up on the historical perspective Professor DeVault spoke about, the pay gap is improving, but specifically in the 5 years since the enactment of the Lilly Ledbetter Fair Pay Act, it's really not a long enough time span to be able to attribute improvements to that legislation. And when we look at pay disparities, it's really important to choose an appropriate comparison. And there's a lot of confusion in the current discussion about what the size of the gender pay gap really is. Now, the most commonly cited statistic is what I refer to as the 77 cents statistic. And this statistic says that women earn 77 cents for every dollar earned by their male counterparts. And for those of you who listened to President Obama's State of the Union address last night, he actually made reference to this 77 cents statistic. So it's really important to think of this 77 cents statistic as an average. And if we really want to understand the true magnitude of the gap, we have to control for some legitimate non-discriminatory factors. And one of the leading researchers on this question is Professor Francine Blau. And the ILR school is very lucky to have Fran Blau here. She couldn't join us live for this presentation, but we'll be hearing from her later in the webcast. And basically, Professor Blau's research shows that a substantial amount of the gender pay gap can be explained by things like occupational choice, industry choice, and labor market experience. There's also a role for race, for union status, and for education. But after we control for these factors, more than half of that gap is explained. There's about 41% that remains unexplained.
And I love this chart because it really shows how you can break this down into what we can measure and what's easily measurable, but it also demonstrates what we don't know, and that 41%. And as a researcher, that 41% is incredibly fascinating to me because what is it? What does it actually mean? So some of the work that I've done on this issue with some of my colleagues on the gender wage gap has really tried to look a little bit into this 41% and move beyond what's easily measurable in terms of an economic perspective into some things that we might not think of as being drivers of this gap. So, for instance, some colleagues and I have done work on the niceness. So you may have heard, they talked about it a little while ago about do nice guys and gals finish last, and this idea of are women penalized for being less aggressive in the workplace, for not being as humble, right? Are women penalized for this? And what we found was that women who were nicer made 5% less than their mean girl counterparts, for lack of a better term. But what I thought was incredibly interesting was that men who were nicer made 18% less than their male counterparts who were meaner. And I think that's a really interesting phenomenon because you can go to any bookstore in the United States and go to the self-help section and you can see 1,000 books talking about all the things that women need to do in order to earn equity with men. So all the ways in which women should change and adjust their behaviors in order to achieve this parity. But what you don't see is a similar self-help for men talking about the intragender differences we see in pay for them. And interestingly, we have other work that's looked at attitudes about gender, so whether someone with a more egalitarian view towards men and women in the workplace makes the same amount as those who have more traditional views or sexist views towards men and women in the workplace. And again, what we find being the biggest driver of these differences are differences between subgroups of men, which I think is a really fascinating look at the gender wage gap and finding the ways in which we can look at individual differences to find out what's really driving this 41%. What I also want to point out is that there's a lot of discussion of choice when we're talking about the gender wage gap. And again, you can look at this chart and see occupational category, industry category choices that individuals make that may sort them into lower paying jobs or lower paying industries that then again break down by gender. But there are a lot of other choices as well that we want to talk about that can have an effect on pay equity and wealth in general. And for scholars of compensation, one of the things that you might be interested in is how a pay package is structured. And indeed, how someone chooses to structure their pay package might have a very big impact on the amount of wealth and earnings that they receive. Luckily for us, again, we have Professor Kevin Halleck here to talk a little bit about how these choices might affect compensation.
I do have work with Craig Olson that shows that men and women may have different preferences over their forms of compensation. Now, one way to figure that out might be to actually ask people, would you rather this or would you rather that? Obviously, workers want more. They want to be paid higher salaries, better benefits, and workers are paid in a variety of different ways. And sometimes there are trade-offs. we worked with a company that actually set the total level of total compensation for the employees, but then let the employees choose the mix of pay across three main categories. They were salary, at-risk bonus, and stock options. And the employees were given the transaction rate between the salary and the stock options, for example. And the findings were really interesting. It's not, these are actual decisions by actual people. And remember, the total compensation was set and the employees could choose the mix. What we found in this organization for this group of workers was that men and women made quite different choices over their compensation. The bottom line is that women chose less risky forms of compensation than men on average. That is, women were much more likely to choose a larger fraction of their pay to come in the form of salary, guaranteed pay, and men were much more likely to choose stock options as a larger fraction of their pay relative to women. Of course, this was also associated with other characteristics of the workers, including things like their level of pay, their level of seniority, and so on. But once we even controlled for all of the characteristics that we had on these workers, there still was a difference between men and women. Women, on average, were less likely to choose at-risk forms of compensation than men. There may well be differences for other protected classes in terms of preferences for compensation as related to the one that I talked about with gender in my other work. One example that we're working on now is by disability status, and the Institute for Compensation Studies is working with the Employment and Disability Institute and ILR on precisely this issue. We're not directly doing the same study as I talked about before. What we're studying with the persons with disabilities is the difference between the wage gap between people with disabilities and people without, which is not dissimilar from the gender wage gap that's often talked about. But the difference between that wage gap and the total compensation gap between people with disabilities and people without. And this is the difference, that often in this kind of research we talk about just wage and salary income, but there are other important components of compensation, for example, health insurance, that may be more important to some kinds of workers than others. Say, for example, if one has a disability or a family member with a disability. What we studied here so far is full-time male workers, and we're working to extend that. And we used 5 different national data survey data sets. We used restricted access data from the Department of Labor on the components of total rewards. And we found, consistent with what we expected, that the wage gap between people with disabilities and people without is bigger than the total compensation gap. And what that may mean is that persons with disabilities are matching into jobs that have better non-monetary rewards from work, non-cash monetary rewards from work, for example, richer health insurance benefits.
So first of all, thanks to Kevin for talking about that, and I want to make sure that I revisit that here in a moment. But I want to answer a couple of questions that have popped up while Kevin was talking about the preceding chart. And I told you how much I like the chart, so I want to make sure that I can clarify that for you guys. There was first a question about the negative 6% about educational attainment. Now, feel free to go and reference Fran's work. We can make that link available to you. It's very interesting in and of itself. But the negative 6% means that women actually have a greater return on their educational investment than men do. So education is even more powerful, I guess, for women in terms of wage attainment. And there's another thing that was brought up about hours worked. The chart that we showed you was really looking at full-time workers, so we were able to control, well, not we, they were able to control for hours worked in that overall analysis. But anytime you have economists looking at this, you empirically control for hours worked in every step of the equation. So absolutely great questions. Keep them coming. I wanted to touch back on what Kevin Halleck had just mentioned, because he was really talking about choice. Now, in the research that I do, I've been thinking a lot about couples and how individuals make decisions, and harking back to Lilly Ledbetter talking about how she came home and she talked to her husband about this, what should she do about it. And I think that's a very important point, because when Kevin was talking about his research, I thought to myself, I wonder if those women and those men talk to their partners about what they would choose in terms of a compensation package. Because, the vast majority of us, or at least a large proportion of us, are, if not married, we're we're in committed cohabiting couples and we're making decisions as a unit. And if it's not a spouse or a partner, we're making decisions based on our children, our cousins, or friends, or other people in our lives who are affecting our decisions. And some of the research that I've done on this indicates just how important this couple context is for understanding equity in general. So you can see up here a couple of points from some of my recent research on this idea of household bargaining and the way in which couples make decisions about the workplace. And I just wanted to highlight the fact that this idea of how couples make decisions is something that adds complexity to the experience of wage inequity, but it also helps us understand it a little bit more, because individuals, we don't make decisions in silos, and oftentimes we can talk about what's equal and what's parity and what's normal and rational from a household perspective and not just from an individual perspective. And you can see here that there are gender differences in the way that men and women approach these decisions with their spouses and partners.
And Beth, you make an interesting point about information sharing within the household in these joint decisions. But with respect to pay equity, if we're not talking about negotiations within the household, that information is not always available. In Lilly Ledbetter's case, the only way that she found out she was earning less than her male colleagues was this anonymous note that was left for her. And it's typically the case where people don't have all of the information that they need to make an assessment about whether or not they're being paid fairly. And there's actually a lot of confusion about what compensation information employees are entitled to and what kinds of policies and procedures employers can and should have in place to deal with the issue of compensation information being made available. There's an interesting study that was done. It's called the IWPR Rockefeller Survey of Economic Security. And according to that study, 20% of respondents indicated that discussions about compensation was prohibited by their company policy. And another 28% of respondents said that conversations about compensation was strongly discouraged. Now, there are certain provisions that entitle employees to information about compensation and allow them to have compensation discussions. And as we're going to hear in a moment from Esther Bigler, the National Labor Relations Act actually entitles workers to be able to communicate with each other, whether that's verbal communication, written communication, social media communication. They're allowed to have discussions about the terms and conditions of employment, and that includes compensation. And the interesting thing about the National Labor Relations Act is it's not restricted to just unionized workforces. It doesn't matter whether your workforce is union or non-union. It applies to everybody equally, irrespective of union status. So let's hear what Esther Bigler has to say on this issue.
Employees have the rights to wage information. You can't engage in protected concerted activity to improve your wages if you don't have the information. And what we have seen is many companies have rules or policies which make that information confidential and do not give it to employees. The National Labor Relations Act in Section 7 protects the rights of employees to engage in protected concerted activity for mutual aid or protection or for collective bargaining. For our purposes, we're going to be talking about mutual aid or protection. It involves protecting employees whether they're union or non-union employees. That part of Section 7 is enforced by another section of the Act, Section 8A1, which makes clear that employers cannot interfere with employees engaging in protected concerted activity. So, what is protected concerted activity? That is two employees getting together to work to improve wages, hours, or working conditions. It may mean also an employee who acts alone, but who may be considering and discussing it with other employees before he or she acts, or it may be the person acting on behalf of other employees. Employees have to have access to that wage information for them to be able to engage in mutual aid or protection. I'd also like to note that discussion of this sort on Facebook or Twitter or other social media also has protection under the National Labor Relations Act, as long as we're involved with protected concerted activity and it's to improve wages or other terms and conditions of employment. What's not protected is trade secrets, confidential information about customers, information about how a company operates. Here we're talking about wage information so that employees are able to know what they're paid and are able to perhaps work with other employees to increase their wages or change other terms and conditions of employment.
The National Labor Relations Act and the Lilly Ledbetter Fair Pay Act are only two pieces of legislation that deal with equal pay. There's also the Equal Pay Act, Title VII of the Civil Rights Act, the Americans with Disabilities Act, and the Age Discrimination in Employment Act, which deal with protected classes like gender, race, ethnicity, disability status, and also age. And currently there's one piece of proposed legislation that addresses equal pay, and that's the Paycheck Fairness Act. And we don't have time today to really get into the details of the Paycheck Fairness Act, but it would modify and strengthen certain provisions of the Equal Pay Act and the Fair Labor Standards Act. So that is on the horizon.
I think it's really important for us to talk about this legislation that's on the horizon because it's, you know, the Lilly Ledbetter Pay Act was one of the first of its kind in years to come through to really be pushing fairness and equity and civil rights in terms of equity and fairness from a federal level. And legislation is always important to think what's on the horizon and where are we moving forward. What's interesting in some of the work that I do is looking beyond legislative fixes for this in terms of what else do we need to look at in moving equity forward and talking about where are we going in the future in terms of pay equity and fairness. One of the things that I found in research that I had with Professor Tim Judge from the University of Notre Dame was that gender egalitarianism, this idea that men and women should share the work and family roles, that males are not somehow better suited for breadwinning and women for nurturing, this idea of egalitarianism is actually on the rise. So people are becoming much more egalitarian in their views towards gender over time. And not just in terms of timing, but actually as we age, we become more egalitarian as we have these experiences with women in the workplace. And I think it harkens back again to what Lilly Ledbetter was talking about with her husband and having these experiences in the Deep South and going through and realizing that this fairness is something important and it is a family, a household issue. But what's interesting about this as well is that as cultural norms change, will we see some of this pay gap begin to dissipate? And what sort of effect can we have on pushing social norms forward? What sort of conversations can we have to move this forward? When we looked at our research in terms of what the gender pay gap looked like among individuals with these egalitarian attitudes towards gender, we saw that it basically disappeared. That among egalitarian men and egalitarian women, the gender wage gap was essentially nil. Now this is very interesting because what it tells us is that these attitudes are predicting the size of the gender wage gap, and if we can continue to move those attitudes forward and have those difficult discussions about cultural norms in society, in the workplace, etc., maybe we can continue and not sit stagnant with the gender wage gap as we currently see it. I also think it's interesting to talk about the fact that in a lot of the research that I do, I'm finding these really interesting subgroup differences among groups of men. So finding that it's not just women versus men in terms of pay equity, but there are groups of men that based on their personality traits and individual differences are not being paid the same amount as their male counterparts that are different on those individual differences. And that sense of unfairness for no reason at all except for some arbitrary idea of stereotypes about what makes a better manager or what men should be like in the workplace, I think that's an interesting conversation to have as well, because as with every single component of inequality we see in society, it's not just women who are suffering from this, and the way we can communicate that more broadly, I think, will allow us to contribute to this cultural change and move the issue of equity forward. Along those lines, we have a broader discussion about inequality on a societal level that can communicate to us a little bit about how we move the discussion of pay equality forward into the future. And for that, we have a discussion that Professor Fran Blau had talking about the issue of inequality back in 2012.
There's been a lot of attention about the 1%, and it's justified. I mean, incomes at the very top, the 1%, the 0.01%, they've gone off the charts. But what's lost in that, and what I really want to emphasize, is what I call a growing educational divide. The difference, as the college wage premium has and income premium has grown, the difference between what more highly educated people earn and what less highly educated people earn. And indeed, one estimate put the overall increase in inequality as about 2/3 due to these greater differences across education groups. And I'm using the term divide because our society is getting divided. It's not just that the more highly educated are earning higher incomes. They're healthier, they're living longer, they're less obese. They have less of an issue with female-headed families. Female-headed families are increasingly concentrated among those who have not completed high school or just high school graduates. Now, why is that a problem? Well, there's a much higher poverty problem among those families. So we're getting to be almost, I don't want to say, but like two societies, as it were, you know. And what we need to do, again, is to bring the less educated groups into higher education. Let me just give you some eye-opening information from a recent OECD report. Now, I'd say eye-opening because this was even eye-opening to me. The OECD is the Organization for Economic Development, Economic Cooperation and Development. Every country, the more educated your parents are, the more likely that you will pursue higher education. But the United States was close to the bottom for children of low-educated people being able to pursue higher education. Inequality has been rising for the past 3 decades in the United States to historical high levels, to levels way beyond what they are in other countries. And more broadly, educating the population can help combat the problem of inequality.
So when you were thinking about overall pay inequality, it is important to think about overall societal inequality. And I think it was very interesting for Fran to really talk about the gaps that we're seeing and what these gaps actually mean and the way they factor into returns on education and differences in education and the way that those things might also be affecting pay inequality as we move forward. And again, there are large discussions that we can have about educational differences, about career tracks that women track into when they enter college, about women in STEM fields. We have a lot of conversations, and in fact, we probably should have a completely new webcast on that topic in general that we can have moving forward. But I do think that it sets the stage for a broader cultural change and a conversation about how pay equity in general is not just a women's issue, it really is a societal issue and an issue of fairness.
Absolutely. And, you know, as Beth mentioned, it's a societal issue. It's a complex process. I mean, we've talked about a variety of issues just this afternoon. We started with a relatively straightforward example of Lilly Ledbetter, and, you know, we can compare her to 3 males who are working in her same job. So there's no issue of occupational segregation or anything like that. It's relatively straightforward. We can add layers of complexity when we start to introduce occupational segregation, when we talk about things like Beth's research that looks at societal values and cultural changes that have taken place. We also have to talk about individual and household choices and the constraints on those choices. The constraints aspect is often missed in that discussion. We can add on top of that information about employee rights and what employees are entitled to in terms of compensation information and how they're allowed to communicate with one another about those compensation figures. And, you know, at the top level of the discussion, it's really talking about growing inequality. If we don't resolve this issue, we're going to have a persistence of inequality of income that in turn translates into an education gap and overall earnings gaps for society as a whole. Now, we've had several questions come in, people wanting to know how they can tell if people are being paid equitably. It's a very complicated question with a very complicated answer. There's no simple litmus test, yes or no, to be able to figure this out. Usually the way that you can tell if somebody's being paid equitably is through some sort of a quantitative analysis of compensation. And there are a variety of pieces of information that are necessary to perform that analysis. So it's really not as simple as calculating an average or a median and, you know, doing a simple yes-no kind of test. It's very complex.
Absolutely. It's interesting that you bring that up, because in the field of human resource studies, which is, you know, and I'm teaching, and I think about these issues and I'm teaching them to my students, and you know, it is a complex issue. You can spend years studying compensation and constantly be thinking about equity. And I think that the companies that do this best are thinking about those things. They're pulling up and making things, the policies and procedures, as clear as possible in terms of what are the compensable factors we're talking about here. What are we paying? What are we rewarding? And what does that say about us as a company? And it's a complex issue, but again, I don't think that means you can't do it. I just think it means you need to put a little bit more effort into doing it well.
Absolutely. And we actually did have a question, somebody wanting to know what employers can do to make sure that they're paying their people equitably. For me, from my perspective, I think that, you know, doing a self-examination of what your compensation policies and practices are is really important. You know, taking a look at that quantitative analysis on an annual basis. I also think it's really important to have pay transparency. It's important to communicate your pay policies and practices to your employees so that they understand how they're actually being paid. You could have the best policy in the world, and if your employees don't understand it, there's still an opportunity for feelings of unfairness, even though you may be paying people appropriately.
Those are great points, Stephanie, and I do appreciate that. And we love the questions coming in. We're trying to address them as they come in. I've noticed a couple questions about my research, which of course I love to talk about, so I'm happy to try to address. So I'll address a couple of those things and direct you in different directions, and then we'll move on to a couple of other questions as well. So the first question that was asked about whether, you know, okay, so don't women experience backlash in the workplace when they act in these kind of stereotypically masculine ways, when they act aggressive, right? And indeed, there's a large literature, actually by Madeline Heilman, on backlash, and Lori Redman on backlash among women who act in these aggressive ways. It's fascinating literature, a lot of really interesting experiments done about how we promote people and how we rate their performance. So absolutely, that is built in. And indeed, we did find, you know, this interesting effect in which we thought that women would be penalized for acting out of stereotype, when really, you know, there wasn't much of a negative for acting in this way. So it was a fascinating way. But again, we're looking just at wages and not necessarily at all these other intangible things that can happen in the workplace. And some of that might have to do with, again, the sort of jobs you feel comfortable choosing. If you have this sort of more aggressive attitude, you might feel more comfortable in these high-powered, high-paying jobs. We talked about occupational segregation before. There's also a question about negotiation and the way in which some of these individual differences and gender wage gap and individual differences and how they affect the gender wage gap might factor into this pre-employment negotiation process. There's a large literature out there on gender and negotiation. It's been done and done and done and done and done, and some interesting highlights from that. And I'm happy to direct you in the direction of research if you want to read a little bit more about it, is that we find that there actually aren't very many differences in terms of the ways in which men and women negotiate. It's the fact that women tend to negotiate less often. So they initiate these things less often, and they get poor outcomes from negotiation than men do. So women often get a lower return on their effort, and they often don't even put in the effort to begin with. One thing that is interesting from that literature is that although we do find that women are less likely to negotiate, they're actually just as likely to negotiate as men are when they're negotiating on behalf of somebody else. So when they're not negotiating for themselves. So this idea of self-promotion that comes into play, that of course can factor into whether someone is paid. So a question here that that came up that might be interesting is about the effect that of the Health Care Act might have on this idea of compensation. And we didn't talk a lot about how benefits roll into this idea of wages and equity. And I don't know, Stephanie, if you have any ideas, the ways in which these compensation packages might differ and what companies should be thinking about as they're moving forward.
Well, I think it ties back into what Kevin was saying about pay mix. And, you know, most of the research that's been done on the gender pay gap has focused solely on earnings. There hasn't been a lot of research that's looked at total compensation. Part of the reason for that is because it's oftentimes difficult to put monetary values on various benefits. As Kevin indicated, when we control for benefits, or when we include benefits and look at total compensation as opposed to just the wage portion, that gender pay gap does narrow. So I would encourage employers, when you're looking at this issue, to really think about your comprehensive total rewards package and not focus exclusively on, what are we doing with wages, or what are we doing with health care, or what are we doing with 401k. Really take a holistic total rewards approach to addressing that question.
That's a great point. That's a great point because, when we're also thinking about this, when we're talking about compensable factors and total rewards and how we're actually paying people, it is also important to think about the fact that, the individual differences I was talking about, sometimes those are things you want to reward.
Absolutely.
Sometimes there are individual differences that are important to performance. I think the real key here, and is something that as compensation researchers you stress, and as we in human resources we stress as well, is do they actually affect performance? Is this actually something that's worth being paid, or is it something that's based in a norm that's somewhat antiquated, or an institutionalized norm that doesn't actually affect the bottom line, that it doesn't fit with our strategy as an organization, and does it result in unfair outcomes that we can't justify based on performance?
Absolutely.
Yeah, so it's a very complicated issue. But again, I think, hearkening back to what you said before, a lot of it is about transparency, and not just transparency with your employees, but transparency with yourself.
Absolutely.
Who are we as an organization? What are we trying to do? And a lot of the kind of reactiveness, I think, that can come from really reacting to lawsuits that can come from these sort of things can cause you to not realize all the things you can do proactively if you start thinking about these things ahead of time. Like you said, pay mix, what are you thinking about? Don't be so reactive and pick and choose, but really think holistically about total rewards and who are we, and what's our overall compensation strategy as an organization.
Absolutely. We had some questions that came in prior to the webcast that related to individuals' personal experiences. So people would describe, I'm experiencing this situation at work, what do you suggest that I do? We're not going to be able to address all those personal situation questions, but we will encourage you to take advantage of the processes that are in place in your workplace, in the regulatory agencies such as the EEOC, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, and with the Department of Labor. So if you have questions about a personal situation, we can't address them here, but take advantage of those procedures that are in place.
That's a great point, Stephanie, because we actually did have a question coming in saying, well, what are the federal organizations that assist people, and what are the ones that investigate this? And I think you made a great point. The EEOC, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, does a lot of this work, and they will investigate the merit. But even if they don't represent you, you still have the ability to bring a suit on your own,
Absolutely.
even if you don't have that support. And there are also we're talking about federal laws here to be as widespread as possible in terms of applicability, and federal agencies, et cetera. But states have their own laws and their own framework of laws that affect pay equity as well. So depending on what state you're in, you're going to want to look at state regulatory agencies as well to see what options are available to you moving forward.
And it's important also to think about municipalities and county level things
too.
Yeah. Because there are some municipalities and cities that have different sets of protected characteristics.
Absolutely.
Some cities recognize sexual orientation as a protected characteristic, others don't. So, whether you're approaching it from a worker perspective and concerned about your own pay, or whether you're approaching it from the employer perspective and trying to proactively get on top of this issue, it's really important to understand what federal, state, and local laws apply to your situation.
And I think that it's also interesting to think about how these sorts of legislative pushes forward, because the Lilly Ledbetter Pay Act, as we heard earlier, was a legislative fix to something that wasn't necessarily anticipated to come with what the spirit of the law should have been.
Right.
That was the idea behind it. And when it was first proposed, it was, well, are we going to have this flood of lawsuits that come through? And I don't think we saw that.
We didn't, and I was actually one of the people that was surprised by that. I thought that it would spur a lot more litigation than what we actually saw. But if we look at the EEOC charge statistics, they've stayed relatively stable at around 1,000 charges per year. We haven't really seen that big uptick in litigation that everybody was sort of bracing for.
And it's interesting to think about the whys of that. And obviously, I think a lot of the things, the research that I presented to you before, some of the research that some of our guests presented in their videos as well, it's always the why question. Why did this happen? Why do we find these things? And sometimes that's a lot more difficult. We have conjectures we of course can make,
sure.
but it's a lot more difficult to get at the actual why these things are happening. But it also is why it's important for what we do here at the ILR school is to continue that research. We have some of the most brilliant people, I speak of course biased, but doing this research and really trying to investigate not just pay inequities that happened historically, right? We have great labor historians who are doing this work, but also where are we moving in the future, and not just legislatively and unions and the way in which we can move those public policy things forward, but also what organizations and corporate HR can do to step in to prevent these sorts of things from happening as well.
Absolutely. And from my perspective, I think that being proactive about the whole issue is the best approach to take. So if you can get on top of these issues, it's better.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with that. I think when you're moving forward and you're thinking about these things, there are quite a few different ways that organizations can take in terms of thinking about whether they're likely to be sued, right, and whether litigation is possible. And obviously we know that these laws are important because we have seen all the gains that we can make when companies have to actually think about these things. But one of the things that I think really drives it is something like you said about being proactive, because it's not necessarily, and early on I think of course you have the reactivity, and companies you're having lawsuits and you're having fights that get up to the Supreme Court level where you're trying to figure out what does this law actually mean? Right. What can we get away with? How do we have to change structurally who we are as an organization? But I think what you're seeing, particularly as management changes, as society changes in terms of what companies are and what they do, and how we learn best practices about how to pay people better and how to promote performance and how to manage. As we learn those things, I think companies have realized that being ahead of this equity issue is important. And it's not just important because we might get sued otherwise, right? Which of course is important, but it's also an important thing to consider because fairness to our employees means they're more loyal to us, they perform better, they don't talk bad about us on social media, all those things that are important. And I think if we take the broad view and we step back and we really look at all the ways that inequality can affect women, and if you go by my research can also affect subgroups of men, then we do want to take that proactive big picture view.
Absolutely. There are definitely competitive advantages to paying everybody equitably.
Yes,
Absolutely.
I completely agree with that. So I think we have a couple more questions here that I think we can try to address and then wrap it up. And feel free, of course, to contact any of us with our contact information if you want to continue the discussion. We're happy to do that as we move forward. So a couple of other questions here, and I'll ask you this. If the last check issued started the 180-day clock, right, does every pension or Social Security check restart the clock?
Under the Lilly Ledbetter Fair Pay Act, it does. Anytime wages or any form of compensation is paid, the clock resets. If those future payments are based on a discriminatory event that happened in the past. So if you were initially hired in at an inappropriately low salary 20 years ago, the last paycheck you receive before you retire, all of your retirement benefits, those are going to reset the clock, and you'll have the opportunity to go back to that initial allegedly discriminatory decision 20 years ago.
Great. That's a great point. Thank you. And one more question that I'll ask is about my research, so I'll go ahead and ask it. And I didn't really go into detail with the slide that I put up about how men and women negotiate these sorts of household decisions that can affect equity, was why doesn't support for men moderate female burnout? Oh, why? Why? I wish I knew why. No, it was one of those interesting findings that we found that was a gender difference that we didn't necessarily expect. And what we found was that, when women are supportive spouses, when men report that their wives are more supportive of them, because this was a study done amongst cohabitating or married heterosexual couples, when they found that they had this sort of support, that it allowed them to feel less burnt out from working long hours at the workplace. So their wives' support mattered a lot to them. We We did not find any effect whatsoever of having a supportive husband. Now, one thing to keep in mind is may have something to do with how we measured support. It was a lot of emotional support, a lot of, hey, I believe in you, but not necessarily maybe the household labor support that might actually make you feel less stressed. We know that there are differences in the amount of household labor. Although men are doing more and women are doing less than ever, there's still a large gap in terms of household labor. And there's also a large gap in terms of who's responsible for things, this household CEO sort of idea that even if men do more of the household labor, they may not actually be responsible for it. And society, of course, judges women's household labor differently than men's. There's a whole literature on that as well. We do a lot of research, but it is an interesting finding and something that I would love to investigate further.
All right. And I think with that, we're going to end the webcast for today. If you have any additional questions, please feel free to reach out and email us. We'll be happy to try to respond to as many of those questions as we possibly can.
Thanks.
Thank you, Beth and Stephanie. It's been my pleasure to be part of our conversation today, but the discussion doesn't stop here. The ILR school faculty will continue their cutting-edge research on pay gaps, workplace practices, and inequality in general. My own home institute, the Institute for Compensation Studies, has contributed expert opinion to state-level policy panels, most recently the State of Connecticut Task Force on Gender Pay Gap, and this spring we'll be hosting an executive seminar in New York City on various dimensions of pay equity, including the new requirements for the CEO to median worker pay ratio to be reported for publicly listed companies. We also have our Workers Institute with its new Equity at Work initiative that includes research programming and undergraduate teaching, the Labor and Employment Law program, in addition to the Title VII Consent Decree Repository, which it's created and maintained, has many upcoming programs this spring that are likely to be of interest to some of you. And let's not forget ILR's preeminent Employment and Disability Institute, which since the mid-1960s has been giving research, teaching, technical advice to employers about expanding the employment of people with disabilities. And our Human Capital Development Program has many program offerings in the HR field that relate to this topic. If you want to read more research that we've mentioned today, we have a list of resources here. And just thank you for taking the time to be with us for this conversation on this significant anniversary.